It's not uncommon to encounter or work for a narcissistic leader. You know, that charismatic guy or gal who adores their own reflection and insists their followers be affirming and adoring of their greatness. And while their people are working long and hard, they themselves find time for daily self admiration sessions. They recount tales of their unmatched brilliance, leaving no room for accountability or self reflection. Their team meetings are more like one person prep rallies where they exalt their supposed exceptionalness while blinding themselves to the ideas and concerns of their team members. As for feedback, why bother with the opinions of mere mortals when they already possess that all encompassing wisdom? In their universe, it's an exception that others contribute to the expansion of their insatiable ego, all while accountability remains but a distant and inconvenient concept. Stay tuned as we explore how narcissistic leaders contribute to a lack of accountability.
Welcome to Dismantling Dysfunction, a podcast series for anyone who is ready to eliminate the dysfunction they experience in their organizations, leaders, or relationships. Each week, we explore common dysfunctions in organizations, delving into the systemic causes behind them, and giving you the exact tools and practical tips you need to dismantle them. Now, here are your hosts, organizational development and behavioral change experts, Dr. Anne Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Do we have a great conversation for you today as we talk about one of our favorite things, narcissism at work? We are continuing our series on accountability as we tackle this widespread issue of its dysfunction within organizations. Now, in our previous episode, we explored how leaders sometimes miss that valuable opportunity to really foster meaningful relationships with their employees and how they struggle to engage them effectively during the review of performance process, which is a key aspect of accountability. We highlighted that common scenario where leaders, due to inexperience or anxiety, tend to dominate the conversation or inadvertently fail to create that environment where employees really feel that sense of belonging and genuine interest from their direct managers. Now, today, we are going to focus just on that often overlooked behavioral impediment to accountability, narcissistic tendencies amongst leaders. And we've got some great stories for you today. I'm sure that we'll be sharing. We're going to unravel how these tendencies, often operating on a subconscious level, can hinder accountability. And it's a really critical topic that warrants our attention as we strive to understand and address the multifaceted challenges surrounding accountability in the workplace. Now, but before we continue, just want to do that reminder of don't forget to subscribe if you're catching us on YouTube. Turn on the notification bell to make sure that you don't miss out on a single one of our upcoming videos. If you're watching this live on LinkedIn, welcome. Make sure also that you're following us on LinkedIn so that you get notified of all of our upcoming videos and sessions and content. And we really appreciate it if you take some time to give this content a thumbs up or post a comment on LinkedIn. This just helps others just like you to find our content. So with that, let's explore this epidemic of a lack of accountability in organizations.
Hey, everybody. You're absolutely right, Heather. This is a fantastic topic for us to be talking about because although we're talking about narcissistic leaders and accountability today, we could equally be talking about the prevalence of narcissistic employees as well. But it's like this secret behavioral issue that everybody knows about it, but nobody's really naming it for what it is. And so they're not grappling really with the challenges that are posed by narcissistic leaders. And when we discuss narcissistic leaders in this context, we aren't necessarily referring to leaders with a clinically diagnosed personality disorder. It's the ones that habitually use certain behaviors and shields, as we call them, to make people believe that they're great. It's a more subtle phenomenon where leaders employ narcissistic defenses against feeling inadequate or incompetent. And they rely on this image of themselves as the great leader, expecting their employees to really validate them for their idea about who they are, with them never having proven it at all. And the image conscious traits often associated with narcissists, they're really aligned with what leaders need, actually, like the ability, being charismatic, being engaging with people, making people believe in what is possible, exciting them with a compelling vision, and their confidence in themselves. And of course, this on the surface creates this illusion that people buy into. But underneath it all, there's a self-serving agenda that can disrupt the alignment with the organization's values, vision, and objective of all of the employees' performance that surround that narcissistic leader.
Yeah, this is so true. And I think that, it is tough sometimes. I know we have this conversation with our client all the time about narcissistic defenses, because they don't, when they're looking at the behavior of their leaders trying to put their finger on something, but they don't necessarily automatically go to that. And so it is an important one, that because this way that they behave, it's not always as overt. It is a defense mechanism that they use, and they can come across, and a lot of them do. They're very competent, and this is an important thing to think about, is that when we're talking about the narcissistic leader in this context, it's not that they're not competent, but there are places where they go to these particular defenses, and that transcends their charisma and their visionary thinking, right? And when you think about leaders and what they're doing, they are responsible for so much, that entire spectrum of business operations, performance, employee well-being, the overall employee experience. Yet for the narcissistic leader, this broader perspective can often take a back seat in some of that, their own belief in their greatness, or their need for things around them to reflect back on that greatness. In their world, it's like they're perfect. And so if you work for one and something goes wrong, the first thing they are going to do is make it about you, so that it doesn't in any way impede upon that image that they have of themselves. And, it's as though they're incapable of any wrongdoing or misjudgment. And as a result of that, they become really ineffective in the accountability process. And one of the greatest challenges that's posed by the narcissistic leaders really does lie in that conviction that not only are they exceptional, but everyone else should unquestionably recognize and affirm that greatness. And we talk about it reflecting back, right? That excessive sense of self-importance really does cast a long shadow of the organization, and really gets in the way of the development of the organization, and becomes quite a blocker for the organization as well. And it obscures that collective effort as well, the shared contributions of the team, and really make it difficult for them to understand the needs, the concerns, the perspectives of others, right? And sometimes we see them sort of come in and sort of swoop in, and here I'm great, and I'm going to make this grand statement, or I'm going to make this grand gesture, but really there's nothing else behind it. And they are known for their credit hoarding. They're quick to put the blame on others, but they will hoard the credit, where they will ultimately deny the contributions of their team, really taking that credit in for themselves.
I love that, calling it credit hoarding, but it's actually what they do. It's there's no I in team. It's only I for them. The team takes a second place, and whatever the team does, they take the credit for it. And this inability or even unwillingness to acknowledge the contributions of their team really causes problems around accountability, because you can imagine how demotivating it is to the team members to have really given something their all, only to have the credit hijacked by their narcissistic leader. And another significant challenge posed by these leaders is their tendency to deny their mistakes. And so it's like they split the world into good and bad, and they're all good, and everything outside of them is bad. And so if they make a mistake, they won't admit it. They find it really difficult to say that they're wrong, or they made an error in judgment. even when evidence supports the fact that they did it wrong. And they'll insist that something didn't happen or it happened differently than it actually did. And this distorting of reality really creates confusion for their peoples, and they cause their employees to doubt their own reality. And, this is basically gaslighting 101. It's their primary tool. They make the other person believe that they don't know what they're talking about. So this denial also leads to a culture of blame shifting, where others are held responsible for the leader's mistakes. And this, both gaslighting and blaming, lead employees to be disengaged, demotivated. And then, they set themselves up for being real victims because they're not performing, and they fall out of favor with their narcissistic boss.
Yeah, it's that gaslighting, right? It's always that bit of that. Did that really just happen? And we sometimes talk about it as devaluing, right? It's like I'm gonna make you, put you in your place so that I can again continue to hold my own. One of the other challenges, and there certainly are many challenges to accountability in the narcissistic fold, but what is the lack of transparency that narcissistic leaders bring. They really do tend to keep their decision-making process quite hidden. And part of that is so that they never get exposed for anything. And it's hidden to the team members. It can be hidden to the organization stakeholders. And so often people will talk about not really knowing what's going on, right? That little bit of that black box, but it really does create some significant obstacles when it comes to holding them accountable for their actions. And, a client that I was speaking to recently was talking about, it quite interestingly, where I made this statement and nobody came to me and asked me why that was important. And so even in their decision making process, or what they might know is the direction should go, it's like they don't feel like they have to be the ones to explain it to others. And this, again, it holds them outside of the group, and therefore holds them outside of any sort of accountability, because it's easy for them to then say, oh, well, nobody asked me that particular question, so I didn't share that particular piece of information, right? So that lack of transparency, it not only erodes trust within the organization, but really does hinder that ability to understand and assess the rationale of what's going on. And so again, we can be tricked into thinking that there's nothing going on, and not really looking at their behavior in that objective way. Team members end up feeling like they're left in the dark, unaware of the reasoning. Again, why are they making these decisions? Not what's the decision, but the why. They don't get into that. And that can lead to a lot of confusion and frustration. And, even over time, sort of a loss of confidence in the leaders of the organization. And when that happens, people move away from that place of really holding accountability, not just relative to whoever is the leader, but across the whole organization. And a lot of times that absence of transparency, it sort of helps our narcissistic leaders out, because it's hard to scrutinize them. We don't really know, if we can't, we don't have that information that they're working from, then it makes it harder for us to question or challenge, or again, allowing them to operate with any sort of sense of impunity. And that lack of accountability of the narcissistic leader, who's, again, it's like, it's not about me, it's about everyone else, can really have far-reaching consequences in organizations. It really can, if we think about it from that perspective of how it can undermine the organization's overall performance. And we've seen this, right? It can be really divisive within the organization, and it can get in the way of the organization's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. And, we see it all the time, Anne, where we've got clients that are under a lot of stress, heavy load, especially right now with today's economic climate, where these narcissistic leaders are, their defenses are way up, and then at a time where they need heightened accountability in their organization, they just aren't able to foster it.
Yeah, and when you're talking, Heather, I was thinking of how much uncertainty they create through their lack of transparency, and never really being definitive, and never letting their employees or even their peers be in the know about what's going on. And so even in a secure environment, there's a tendency for employees to get self-protective and go into their own defenses And some of them, what they'll actually do is they'll enable their leader trying to meet expectations that the narcissistic leader might have expected of them, but were actually impossible to meet, because they're known to really put out unrealistic expectations for themselves and their teams, but they don't hold themselves accountable. If they don't meet their goal, they'll just say, oh yeah, well, I really didn't want to make that happen, or they'll make some excuse, or they'll say, I changed my mind and focused on this. But if employees don't stay and work and meet the expectations, there is a problem. And there's this fear of consequences and fear of being shamed. It also put me in mind of one of the narcissistic defenses a leader will use when an employee comes and says, can you give me expectations for and timelines for this project? And the narcissistic leader will say something along the lines of, you really expect me to do that for you? You can't do that yourself? And that makes the employee shrink and never go back and ask for anything again. And so this is just one of the everyday examples where a narcissistic leader is so misattuned to the actual needs and the expectations of their role as a leader, that they do what they feel like and what makes them feel good, as opposed to doing what's in the best interest of their employees or team or the organization. And, you know, they don't address underperformance. Of course, they look for that, you know, who's the problem and who's the issue, and we'll fire them. And then we'll get someone else to replace them, which of course erodes the bench strength in the organization. It causes a disruption in the collective team, where they just get a stable team and one person is blamed and has to go. And this really leads to burnout. It erodes morale and really hinders the strengthening of the foundation in the organization.
I find it interesting because, you know, when you think about the narcissistic behavior, these defenses that we observe, you know, in our clients and in the organizations, I don't think anybody thinks of them as being emotional, right? And subjective, but that's what they are, right? These are behaviors in these leaders that are driven by their emotions. And as a result of that, you know, one of the things to really watch for, and we always talk to our clients about this, is when they're using judgmental language, right? Like, you know, it's like and they're not actually giving feedback, because that's the thing, is that they go into that place of judging, right? It's like good, bad, you know, as Anne was saying, it's like, because they can't articulate expectations, they can't articulate what is the gap they're trying to close. And so they come after it from that perspective, from judgment. And so this more subjective and emotional behavior, when employees aren't meeting expectations, you know, we see those narcissistic leaders behaving in a way that is more reactive in those moments, and not forward thinking, not thinking about how do we solve for this, or what was the actual issue that led to this. There's none of that objective processing of these circumstances. It's just this sort of emotional dump so that they can feel better in the moment. And they don't work to actively foresee and address potential issues before they escalate into major challenges. And certainly I've seen it with some of our clients where, you know, the narcissistic leader will sort of abdicate themselves from resolving some of the conflicts that are absolutely within their power and authority to be the ones that are resolving, right? But it's like, well, you guys work it out. This is between you. This has nothing to do with me, as though they're not the leader in the mix here. And they don't get ahead of things until, you know, those problems can really reach critical points and really escalate out. And that reactive behavior can also have really detrimental consequences within an organization. And we see this, Anne commented on it, where we see the employees starting to adapt their own behavior and starting to shut down, or to withhold, or to play small, so that they don't bring out this particular response from their narcissistic leader. And when they don't anticipate or mitigate issues in advance, they can find themselves perpetually firefighting and expending their resources and energy on you know, trying to resolve these, what we're earlier avoidable crises, but never really getting ahead of it, which is I find really interesting. And so then again, it's because it's not reflecting back how they want to see themselves as a great leader. They then stay in that place of blaming and finger pointing and making it not about them. And that's the culture that, comes in, and which is why it's so counter to what we're trying to achieve with accountability, is all of that blaming, all of that finger pointing. Employees and functions in the organization start behaving in that way because everyone's more focused on assigning responsibility for who did it than for actually coming together and saying, what's the issue and how do we actually resolve the issue that we have here?
When you think about it, Heather, how many times over the years have we been called in to resolve issues between two employees, only to find that the actual issue is because the leader isn't managing their performance? Absolutely. And so the employees are acting out. Yep. It's just so prevalent, as you said. They absent themselves from any responsibility at all because the blame lies outside of them. It does not, they take no responsibility for it. Because really their responsibility is to themselves and their own agenda, which, because narcissistic leaders will often be very talented in one area of the business. And if the business is dependent on them for this, they become very tolerant of this leader's behavior. And this impact can be far reaching. Really, its influence on the culture cannot be understated here. When a leader fails to prioritize accountability, this mindset infiltrates the workplace, giving rise to people doing whatever they feel like, a toxic culture or laissez-faire where, the only thing that people care about is not getting in trouble with their narcissistic leader and not being in his bad books. And everyone's trying to, be a part of them because that way they'll be safe. It's a survival strategy. Employees are mostly walking on eggshells, hesitant to voice concerns or assume responsibility, fearing potential backlash or some retribution for speaking out against or contrary to or in opposition to. And this reluctance to engage in open communication, imagine what happens there when there's more infighting and conflict at the levels below, with nobody to, as you were saying, Heather, really name what the issue is and help problem solve. And so problems don't get solved. They fester, ultimately impeding the growth of the business overall.
Yeah, I think about too the fact that some of these narcissistic leaders, when they are feeling pressured, they just disappear too on your direct reports and can abandon them. I'm going to move into dropping our gem for the podcast. That point where we get to giving you some practical insight and that you can take away and begin to work with on this. And I know that we have lots of content on our YouTube channel. If you've gone over there and checked it out around narcissistic leaders, it's one of the things Anne and I love to talk about because it's the reality of what we deal with in the workforce. And so many people will make that comment of, well, they should just be moved out of the organization. And again, we're talking about individuals who use narcissistic defenses unconsciously, and they're typically really strong performers, right? And so it's not that we're just going to come along and say, oh, you use that, sort of self-protective strategy, you need to go. We have to, in our organizations and with our leaders, look at what it is that we do and how we manage, with those individuals and around those individuals in order to be more effective. Because the fact is, they're not going anywhere. And I was having a conversation with a client recently who's struggling a little bit with, really coming to that place of being realistic around her particular direct manager and some of these narcissistic defenses. And it's like, you can change the organization and just find another one in another organization. I mean, they are pretty much, I think, Anne, every client we've worked in, we come across them. So it's really important that for you, if you're a leader, if you are in HR, that you really understand some of the strategies and around how do you manage with this behavior. When we link it up to accountability, accountability alignment all starts out from the perspective of leaders. And accountability and alignment is also how we get narcissistic leaders working in the way and resolving some of this problematic behavior. But the first thing that we always say to our clients is, do not take their behavior personally. That's the first thing that we want you to practice. That's the first thing that we want you to be aware of, is that personalizing of their behavior and what it is that they're saying, and doing that thing where we talk about it. It's like, okay, that's about them. That's not about me. How do I look at this objectively? Because their narcissistic defenses, it's an emotional reaction, and we need to recognize it as such, right? And when we're dealing with it, we need to, again, when we're managing a narcissistic leader, obviously we want to manage them to expectations. And they are the most difficult to coach and to develop because of this inflated self-image, right? It's like they don't want to be touched because they want to be able to hold that image. However, when organizations don't address it, or they don't support the people around the leader to be able to navigate through it, we see all kinds of negative consequences that come out. Decreased employee morale, turnover, performance issues, reputation to damage, even legal troubles that can stem from this behavior. So when we take that more cohesive approach, we talk a lot through accountability and then this idea of alignment, right? Are we in alignment? Are we in alignment? And making sure that those conversations are happening within the organization. When we take a more cohesive approach to accountability and developing our leaders relative to what it takes for them to foster accountability within their organizations and within themselves, it's actually possible to really mitigate the impact of these narcissistic leaders, because the skills that they learn around accountability is fundamental to being able to work through some of the challenges that come up with narcissistic defenses. It gives them the language, it gives them the tools, even if they're managing up, even if it's their direct manager who's the one that's demonstrating these narcissistic behaviors. So we end up protecting the employees, we protect the organization, we ensure the narcissistic leaders are held accountable, or at least are contained and their impact is not as negative as it could otherwise be. And this is all to the aim of really supporting the success of the organization. And we know, bottom line, when leaders are held to consistent standards around accountability, it stops the damage a narcissistic leader can cause.
I guess it's sort of the bottom line of what you're saying, Heather, is just because they want you to treat them like they're special doesn't mean that you treat them special. Because it's that contribution of other people enabling them to behave the way they behave that it is problematic. And to your point, Heather, many of these people have such talents and abilities. It's a shame when they are let go because they haven't been effectively managed. So that's a wrap for this episode of Dismantling Dysfunction. As always, we're your hosts, Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, and myself, Dr. Ann Dranitsaris. Thanks so much for listening, and join us again for our next episode, where we continue talking about accountability, but we're going to be exploring the hidden blockers to accountability caused by unconscious shaming. This is a good one and comes out of some of the things we talked about today. We'll be discussing how subjective reactions to performance cause leaders to personalize their feedback and use judgmental language like, "You're stupid, this is ridiculous," which shames employees rather than engages them. It's just a taste of the shaming blocker that contributes to the dysfunction of a lack of accountability. And always remember, if you're feeling challenged by the accountability gaps or the leadership behaviors in your organization and want to know more, want to know what you can do about it, reach out to us. Book a complimentary consultation with us. We're always happy to talk to our listeners about how they can actually use our services and use some of the content on our podcasts to raise accountability in their organization.
And as we've mentioned, that this is one of a series on accountability. So if you haven't had a chance to catch them all, hop on over to our YouTube channel. All of the content is there if you're watching it on the video, if you're catching us on the audio, whatever is your favorite podcast platform. Got lots of great content all about dysfunctions in organizations, including all of those related to accountability, and lots more on narcissistic leaders if that's what you want to learn more about. Thank you so much for investing your valuable time in listening and watching to us, whichever platform you're on again, and gaining insights into the competencies that leaders need, or how it is that we deal with narcissistic leaders and accountability in particular, in order to drive the alignment and accountability that you need in your organization. And don't forget, you can catch all of our LinkedIn Live videos and podcasts over on our YouTube channel, Dranitsaris-Hilliard. If you're catching this on our podcast, the information is there in the show notes. Remember to subscribe to our channel or to your favorite podcast platform so that you don't miss out on a single episode, so that we're updated. We're always releasing new videos and new content. And if you found this information helpful, we really do appreciate you giving the video a thumbs up or giving our podcast a rating, sharing it with other leaders who can benefit from it. So again, thanks for being in our audience, and we can't wait to have you back real soon.
Thank you for listening to the Dismantling Dysfunction podcast with Dr. Ann Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, organizational development and behavioral change experts. Be sure to subscribe to get more practical insights and focused tools to help you dismantle dysfunction in your organizations, leaders, or relationships. For more information, visit dismantlingdysfunction.com.